this over to Rusty again, who's here from DC. I'm really, really grateful to have him. I've been following his work for a while, and then when he was out here, I thought, oh, I wonder if I could grab him, and he was willing. So thank you so much, and here you go.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, go. Thanks, Kathy. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm excited to be here. Thanks you all for coming out on a hot day, in the middle of the workday. So yeah, I have a little presentation for you, and I will also try to engage you in conversation throughout. So if you have questions, not full comments or paragraphs, but if you have thoughts or clarifying things along the way, please pop up your hand and let me know. So Kathy asked me to say a few things about myself first, to give you some context. So I studied philanthropy in the nonprofit sector at Indiana University, what's now the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy there. And as a grad student, as a young person, and I was very fortunate to have a fellowship there called the Jane Addams Fellowship, which brings in, it doesn't exist anymore, but it brought in 6 people just out of undergraduate to Indiana from across the country to study from all different disciplines and all different kinds of schools to study our sector, giving, fundraising, grant making, volunteering, our whole sector, the whole ball of wax. So that was my real first formal exposure to what our sector is all about. And subsequently, I had the opportunity to move to New York City, work at the Ford Foundation for a couple of years through a fellowship opportunity they had. There I worked on strengthening the nonprofit sector and philanthropy in a program that they had meant to do that through research, supporting infrastructure groups like Tri-Valley or others. And I was 24 working at the one of the largest foundations around, and it was quite an opportunity, quite a privilege, and also a very rarefied world to be in and to try to understand. And so I helped to start a network for young people, young professionals who are working in foundations and philanthropy. It's called Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy. So I then went and spent 10 years staffing that, building that as the founding executive director. And throughout all those experiences in grad school, in the job, at Ford, and then at EPIP, I kept coming back to these questions about how could we as a sector do a better job of creating more access to our field for young people or others, sector switchers and the like, right? So I just always felt like there was so much potential out there, so much leadership in communities, whether it was young people who were being served by youth serving organizations, don't even realize that they are being plugged into a nonprofit community through that, or being served by a nonprofit, and that they could work in that nonprofit or another one too. Or all kinds of other places, that there are people out there who want to do mission-based work. They're not in it to help somebody else get a profit. They want to do something meaningful. And I just think our field, that fellowship I experienced in Indiana was fantastic. It was 6 kids a year, and it was very expensive to run. And so I kept wondering, well, how could you scale something like that up? And so when I was at my organization, EPIP, I finally got to, in 2011, commission some research about that question. And then we ended up studying how are funders investing in nonprofit careers and nonprofit leadership. And so we did some case studies, but we basically found there's not enough of that kind of thing going on in the field. And so when I was leaving EPIP in my own executive transition out, I decided I wanted to take that piece of research we had done and turn it into an advocacy platform to try to influence the field. And when we did the research, we didn't just look at young people. We really expanded it to the full career. So we did 8 case studies across the career arc. So it started with, I think it was a community foundation in Ohio that was funding paid internships for college students in nonprofits in their city. I'm blanking on this. I think it's the Cleveland Foundation. And it went all the way through, efforts to support retiring nonprofit leaders to give back and volunteer in the field of their incredible skill sets and knowledge. So what I realized is it's not just about young people, because if we recruited a whole bunch of young people into our field and they got here and they said, well, I can't save for retirement, or there's nowhere for me to go in my organization or in this field, it's very flat, it's not, there's just not a lot of places to go, So I realized we needed to invest not just in recruitment and access, but also, throughout that career arc across the whole workforce. So that's how I ended up starting Fund the People in 2014. And the Tides Foundation here in California was our fiscal sponsor for EPIP. So they ended up giving me some fellowship money to do some research about this. And NYU, because I was living in New York City, I was able to get a fellowship at NYU at their School of Public Service, which was amazing because they didn't give me any money. Tides was giving me the money, but NYU gave me access to the university library and faculty and students. So I had some grad students work with me, and I went to the university library and I read, and it was an amazing year and a half or so of doing that. And so I ended up creating a research article called Talent Philanthropy. Why investing in nonprofit people can improve nonprofit effectiveness. And published that in a journal called the Foundation Review, which is kind of a academic practitioner journal of evaluators and funders. And so that kind of launched Fund the People in 2014. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Fund the People. We are a national initiative to maximize investment in the nonprofit workforce. So we try to influence funders, nonprofits, and the intermediaries like Tri-Valley here that bring the field together. We're trying to influence everyone's attitudes and behaviors to say, we've got to change the way we fund and the way we fundraise so that we can transform our field and put people at the center rather than at the margins. So I'll go into more of that, but that's just to give you a sense of what we're all about. So, about 2022 or so, I was working away. It took a while. I've been doing this for 10 years, running Fund the People. And it was really hard at first because this issue of investing in the nonprofit workforce was a back burner, off the radar screen thing in 2014 when we started. It was not the sexy, it was not the, oh my gosh, this is urgent. It was like, what's that? That's niche. To the funding community. And so, but in 2022, there was a group of funders in the Bay Area working at James Irvine Foundation, the San Francisco Foundation, Conrad Hilton Foundation in LA, and the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. And they were talking on Zoom during the pandemic to each other, these program officers, about we all invest in workforce development for California or the Bay Area or whatever. But we don't actually invest in workforce development for the nonprofits that we fund to do workforce development for the Bay Area. And so we're actually end up undermining the workforce, the quality jobs in nonprofits in order to advance quality jobs in for-profits. So they were struggling with, like, how do we get beyond this contradiction? How could we change our practices? So who are you going to call? From the people. So they had me come on to Zoom with them. And we had done this research in 2019 called Talent Justice, which is about how do we blend investing in the nonprofit workforce with the diversity, equity, and inclusion work happening in the field, and make sure that they're connecting with each other. So they said, would you come talk to us about this report you did, Talent Justice? So talked with them, and then 2023, make a long story short, they approached us again and said, we want to bring together a conference of funders in California to talk about these issues. Would some of the people want to partner with us on this? So I said yes, and we ended up creating the California Talent Justice Initiative together. So we decided to break the conversation open. Let's not just bring funders together to talk about this. Let's make it a silo-busting conversation with nonprofits, funders, and again, intermediaries and other stakeholders. And so we said, let's not just do a conference, let's do a series of regional conversations to see what are people really feeling and thinking and experiencing at the more local level across the state. and then let's bring it all together at a conference. And part of that was because I live on the East Coast. I don't know what the hell to talk about California. I'd experienced EPIP had chapters in San Diego, LA, and San Francisco Bay Area, so I'd been out here a lot. I knew people and had relationships, but it was a new day, and so we've been doing that, and part of it was we wanted the conference to be informed by what we heard from people and connect with people more, and that's how we ended up connecting with Kathy and Tri-Valley Nonprofit Alliance. Was we were partnering with Northern California grantmakers to put on our event here in town, or in this area in Northern California, and they have a group of nonprofit advisors from across the 5 counties of Northern California, and they said, let's connect with them as advisors and outreach partners. So that's how we ended up, Kathy and I started talking. So we did a Northern California event 2 weeks ago, we did an LA event, and tomorrow we're doing our San Diego event. And then December 9th through 11th is our statewide summit, and it's happening in Berkeley. And then we'll be hopefully doing more work across the state, more local conversations, more follow-up partnerships in the new year. So that's a little bit about how we got here. And so Kathy said, can you come talk to the Tri-Valley Alliance members while you're in and out of the state? And so that resulted in today. So just a few quick caveats. We focus more on private philanthropy, not government, because we know government dollars are much larger, especially in terms of human services and some other nonprofit fields. But private philanthropy can shift gears a lot faster than government can. And so that's why we focus on foundations and philanthropy. And places like Cal Nonprofits do so much advocacy already on changing like state contracting for nonprofits that we don't need to be doing that too. So we're focusing on changing private philanthropy and fundraising. We emphasize paid work versus volunteer work. So there's obviously tons of nonprofits that have no staff or very few staff. All those amazing volunteers, including the board members at staffed nonprofits, are so important and essential and give such critical labor of love. But we thought there were a lot of people working on volunteerism and volunteer management and all of those things, but again, not enough people were talking about how we invest in our workforce. And it's kind of harder. It's harder to address the complex issues of how do we actually increase salaries and improve benefits and all of those things. It's a complex, thorny problem that you don't get into when you're talking about investing in volunteers. And then, this is the beginning of a conversation, so I don't have all the solutions. There's no easy fixes. So we're just trying to get people thinking, asking questions, and start brainstorming about their own, what needs to change in your own institutions or practices. These are some group agreements about confidentiality. If people say stuff here, let's just leave the story here, take the lessons with in terms of how we talk about it out in the world. Everyone cool with that? Okay. Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to ask you all, so, aside from that we all, are willing to work for less than we deserve and willing to burn ourselves out to do it, what are some of the other great strengths that you perceive in yourself, your colleagues, or in the nonprofit workforce here in the Tri-Valley region? I'm curious if folks take a second to just close your eyes and think about what are some of the strengths and assets of our people. It's going out. Yeah, so just raise your hand, say your name again for me.
I think there's a real spirit of collaboration that has come really in recent years that maybe a decade ago wasn't as present. It's very exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. Collaboration. Spirit of collaboration.
Passion. That's one of the driving forces in the nonprofit community. It's a huge strength.
Passion, yeah. Yes.
Kathy, talking to what she's saying, it makes me think of just the power in numbers, right? Not just the collaboration, but rowing both the same direction, we're all in it together, and no matter what we do, there's power in numbers.
Totally, yeah. Well, we don't think of ourselves as a powerful workforce a lot, but we actually are. I mean, there's more nonprofit workers than some huge industries like manufacturing that you hear about, a lot more. And people talk about creating jobs. In some communities, there's more nonprofit jobs than a lot, it's the biggest employer. If you include the educational institutions like universities and colleges, hospitals, museums, it's a massive workforce and a huge driver of payroll taxes and other contributions to the economy. We're a big, we do the stuff government doesn't want to do or can't do. We do the stuff that the business and the for-profit community doesn't want to do or can't do. We strengthen our democracy, right? Like this is, nonprofits are the place where people find community, and quality of life. Think about that if you lived in a community that had no nonprofits, so you'd have no museums, you'd have no universities or colleges, you'd have no youth centers, community centers, senior centers, you'd only have for-profit hospitals or government hospitals. It would be probably a pretty miserable place. You'd probably have shittier water, shittier air, less parks, less people advocating on behalf of poor people, less social services, less of a social safety net. And that's what all of us and the volunteers we work with make possible. And I really think it's our democracy too. Like, who's getting out the vote? Who's creating civic infrastructure? It's nonprofit folks, not the parties are the political parties are kind of shells of what they used to be, in terms of actual ongoing civic presence, right? So we have a lot of strengths to offer that we often we don't think about for ourselves and we don't talk about it. And it's very important. I'm going to talk a lot about the problems, but I always like to start with what are the strengths that we bring to the table. So Not to preach to the choir, but if you haven't thought about it, it's worth thinking about. And then, so, what do you all think some of the greatest threats are to our workforce these days? What do you, either in your own, there's a lot of people are having trouble recruiting employees, people are leaving the field or thinking about it. What do you think are some of the...
People need to be able to live where they're working and be able to afford to live. Our teams are right on the edge, just like everyone else.
Yeah.
It's threatening to keep it, to build capacity when people jump at that next job because they can't afford to live.
Right.
So getting those salaries up to a livable wage.
I like the way you said it, the pairing of what you just did. The ability to afford to live, so that's like at the individual person level. And then the capacity of the organization, right? Like if you can't keep your staff or support your staff, then your organizational capacity is diminished. You can't deliver services. Anybody else want to share a threat or a challenge to our workforce? Yes.
I think mental health for our frontline workers. It's not seen as that they need mental health support just as much as the clients that they're serving.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, totally. And you hear people talking about burnout a lot now. That's become a big hot topic. But that is all about mental health and workload and all these stressors. So yeah, there's secondary and primary trauma that especially like social workers or frontline people are dealing with, and you just don't put that away when you go home at night. It doesn't. So anyway, okay, so we've got some, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
I think donors.
Say it.
Donors, yeah.
What does that mean?
Donor, I can go to events and see the same donor at the previous 5 events I went to. And so it's caring for our donors in a way that we're also recognizing we're not their only nonprofit, whichever nonprofit is sitting in front of them. And there is donor attrition, there is donor burnout. And while, yeah, we absolutely look out for each other out there, and we collaborate and we care about our partners, I think we are still underlying lovingly fierce competitors when it comes to donors.
Yeah. There's definitely competition for money. Money is very important in the nonprofit sector. So, yes, with it. And I'm sorry, if you guys can just say your name again, too.
Denise Walter.
Denise.
I would say racial equity in hiring and recruitment. I know I wouldn't be in the position I'm in now without really great mentors and allies that helped me along my career. So I can think of maybe 3 development directors of color in this community that I know. And that's a chunk of the bucket. What should we represent people closest to the experience and children?
Yeah, and development jobs are one of the high turnover areas of our field as well. So there's a lot of issues about what's happening with people in our sector right now, whether they're executive directors or in other roles. There's some important research going on and conversations, I think, about race and identity in our workplaces, and it's kind of a crazy situation, but something we need to talk about. So thank you for bringing that up. I saw some other hands pop up. Let me just see if anybody who hasn't said something. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. When I think about a stretch for our workers, it's the fact that leadership, including board and top leadership in nonprofits, doesn't always get this and expects workers to work for very little. And it's that the expectation itself is a problem for workers.
Thank you. Yeah. unless there's other burning thoughts, I will move this along. Thank you for that. And I think we'll come back to the expectations and assumptions on boards and sort of all throughout. So the way I've talked about this a lot is that we have this bottleneck on the nonprofit leadership highway where, there was talk at one point, a lot of the framing in the field has been the challenge facing the nonprofit sector or workforce is a leadership deficit. You guys heard that term, nonprofit sector, leadership deficit. I think it's pretty clear we don't have a deficit of leadership or leaders. That's the framing that, at least when I started doing this work, had been prevalent in the field. It was a very deficit-based mindset. We don't have enough people to fill these jobs. We don't have enough qualified people. We don't have. Instead of saying, we've got an incredible workforce that is stretched to the max that we're underinvesting in. So, then there was this report that came out in 2005, 2006 called the Nonprofit Sector's Leadership Deficit. It was by the Bridgespan Group, very influential consulting firm. And they said the boomers are going to retire, at the traditional retirement age, which was wrong, and in general, and that there aren't enough Gen Xers to fill the positions, and there's more nonprofits every day, and so there's all these jobs that are executive director jobs that are going to be vacant. So we need to go find people in business school to come in and fill this vacuum. And that was the framing that was prevalent when I started doing this work. And so I've tried to reframe that and say, we've got an amazing workforce, but we've got, we're not investing in it. And what we've seen is that the boomers didn't retire at the traditional retirement age. Part of that was the Great Recession, where people's nest eggs were hurt or they didn't want to leave during a recession. That wasn't a good time to retire. They needed to save their organizations. And of course, we've had the pandemic too, and people did the same thing then. I need to stick with it, right? So I think we're seeing now a wave of retirements and resignations that would have happened potentially years ago. But again, people are passionate, people stick with it, they don't want to see their organizations collapse or whatever. So boomers and people at the traditional retirement age for a bunch of reasons, including passion, including economics, including that, we don't invest in retirement savings, so people can't afford to really retire in the traditional way. All these reasons, people didn't really retire. So then the people behind them didn't have a place to go. We're kind of caught in traffic. So. And the thing to remember, and then, so like I'm a Gen Xer, I'm born in 79, so kind of the end of Gen X. So I think a lot of Gen X felt like, we're kind of sitting in traffic behind the boomers. Then kind of the millennials and Gen Zers come along and, say like, well, we want to be leaders now. And so they're kind of sitting, I think of them as like, they're coming on the on-ramp and they're like, looking at their phone like, this seems like a slow highway. Is there anywhere else to go? I can like start a social enterprise and just go off this highway. But, it's not just boomers who, if we don't invest in retirement, then, Gen X and everyone else is going to not be able to retire at the traditional retirement age. If we keep doing relationship-based fundraising that's reliant on charismatic leaders, then people can't afford to leave their organizations because they're worried that the funding will collapse when they leave. So it's a systemic issue, not just a generational, caricature. We all experience the bottlenecks we get into as individual drivers trying to get somewhere, but it's really the road itself that creates the bottleneck. It's not built for this much traffic. And so everybody's in the same bottleneck every day because the road's not being invested in. And so we all feel these symptoms of, at different points in our careers of, inequitable access and entree. If we rely on unpaid internships as the primary entry point into our field, only people who can afford to take an unpaid internship as a young adult get access to the relationships, the experience, the connections that lead to jobs and careers. So that's just one example of the inequity kind of baked in to our roadway. And then from there, it just kind of narrows and narrows if you're talking about, people of color getting into the field, or people from working class and poor communities. Obviously, most of the field is largely made of women, but the higher you go at the bigger organizations, the more male it is at the top. So the roadway just, keeps narrowing. But beneath those symptoms that we all experience is an underlying crisis that I think has been a kind of invisible crisis below. And it's a combination of a chronic crisis and a current crisis that I think has come to a boiling point, where it's become an existential crisis. So the chronic crisis is this long-term deficit of investment in the nonprofit workforce. We did a study, we looked at data from Candid, what used to be the Foundation Center that tracks foundation grants and tags them by what they're for and has all these data from about grants. And so we looked at their data from 1992 to 2011 and found that 1% or less of those grant dollars were going to intentional investments in nonprofits, staff development of any kind. And we did we did some smaller case study work and studies that, found initial data, we don't have a ton of data, but that about 1% of nonprofit budgets are going to staff development. And this is a graph that shows you that data from 92 to 2011, and you see it looks like big peaks and valleys, but the top percentage there is 2.5, and the average really is 1%. And we have a paper about this study on our website, on our toolkit, if you want to dig into the data. Here's another graph. This is actually from the Bridgespan Group, a different study they did in 2015, where they actually kind of shifted their own thinking and said it's not a leadership deficit, it's a leadership development deficit. And they surveyed 438 senior leaders in nonprofits, and among the things they asked is, if you could get leadership development funding for your staff, what kind of funding would you want? And of that, what have you been able to get? And the top thing that people wanted, the light, is overhead funding for talent management capacity.
What does that mean?
Exactly. What does that mean? What does that mean? We don't even have a term for it. It's like a soup of words that kind of strung together. But it starts to make sense as you think about it. As we use this term overhead. I'm not going to get into it all now, but I just want to present this to you and we'll talk about it more. So overhead funding for talent management capacity, 49% of respondents said this was the most valuable kind of funding they could get, and only 7% said they had gotten it. And you see it's like one of the bigger gaps between the demand or value of that kind of funding and the availability of it. So, funders like to provide the stuff down at the bottom, funding for one-off trainings, conferences, other things that are more tangible. But this idea of overhead for talent management capacity is such a straight, you don't even have a word for it. So that's what we've been trying to fill in, is creating language that's positive, not negative, like overhead, which has all these negative connotations. So, were you going to say something? Well, okay. So that's, I think, the chronic crisis. This is more about, from our talent justice study, we found, 84% of foundation professionals in our study said that competitive salaries and bennies were needed for entry-level nonprofit jobs to ensure equitable access, but only 41% say they're providing that kind of funding. So big gap even in what funders perceive is needed and what they're actually doing. Self-reporting. So that's the chronic crisis. The current crisis has really come up, I think of it as like this mountain, and sort of at the base of the mountain is that chronic deficit of investment. And I think it goes way back before 1992, even though that's the data we were looking back. I think it goes back 100, 150 years, more. But piled on top of that have been, the pandemic, the political instability we've seen, our workplaces being torn apart to become remote, all these, this crisis in retention, the worker shortage crisis we already talked about, the burnout, all these things in the last 10 years have kind of been piled on top. And so, it's great that finally people are talking about burnout, funders are talking about burnout in a more real way for the nonprofits they support, but they're still not really thinking about this chronic deficit of investment that's beneath. And all these things are compounding the pressure on our workforce. So, with each slide, I keep trying to dig deeper. Well, what's beneath this? What's beneath this? So I came up with this deficit cycle. Like, what's going on? Why do we have this chronic deficit of investment? And so this is a cycle that shows that we all play a role. We're all part of the problem, which means we can all be part of the solution. So funders don't offer investments in our workforce, generally. They don't see the need. They don't see it as their job. They focus on programmatic excellence. What's the strategy? What's the program do? How many people are you serving? How could you grow it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They focus on the financial health. Show us your 990. Show us your audit. Show us this. What's your overhead ratio? Et cetera, et cetera. Overlooking, never asking about the human health of the organization. They don't see it as their role in general. So that leads to kind of this artificially low supply, and in fact, sends the signal to all of us in the nonprofits that we shouldn't be talking about the human health or lack of health in our organizations. We should keep that quiet. We shouldn't, right? And so nonprofits don't ask. We don't go to our funders and say, we're all burned out. We're under capacity, people are leaving, we're having trouble replacing them. That means services are lowering, going down in availability to the communities we care about and that you, funder, care about. So can you help us address this challenge? That's not generally the message people want to take to their funders. And so, nonprofits habitually under budget for and minimize the need for investing in their staff, which leads to low demand. So funders never hear about this stuff. They don't know what's going on. They're not getting the data about the workforce. So it's a major blind spot for most funders. Most funders want to do a good job. Most funders want to help. Most funders want their money to actually solve a problem that the nonprofit's trying to solve. But if they never hear about what's happening with the staff issues, they're not going to offer, they're not going to think it's their job, they're not going to know. So that's the cycle we're all kind of stuck in general. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with folks? So
I would actually add, though, many funders cap what they will invest, a percentage, right? Donors will say 7%, 9%. So it's not necessary, they actually intentionally cap overhead for staff support.
yeah, they do. And you know what? What's the biggest expense in your guys' budget? What the hell are we doing?
Hiding it.
Like, here's your budget. People, programs. Here's the funder's budget to you. Programs, people. So they don't match. They don't make, it's like a total mismatch. So what I've been saying is we need to flip the formula, the funding formula, so that it matches what nonprofits actually need and spend their money on. And under this cycle is some of the stuff we already talked a bit about. Is those, our old kind of assumptions about who works in nonprofits, who should work in nonprofits. And so, if it's called women's work, it's not valued, it's not paid. So we have these assumptions about gender and work. We have assumptions about race and who, that people of color get served, need services, and, white people are doing the serving. That's just something we don't like to talk about, but it's sort of prevalent in the culture we've inherited in the charity world. And there's classism, right? There's just, I was on the board of a nonprofit where we were paying people so poorly, and it turned out they were all upper middle class or wealthy. And they were very passionate, very good, excellent people working in this organization. But what the executive director realized is we'll never be able to diversify our staff if we keep paying so that only upper middle class and wealthy people can work here. So we had to shift, we had to think differently about benefits. We had to think differently about salaries so that we could grow the staff and grow the diversity of the team. Fear and distrust. Again, we fear loss of funding. Funders fear that nonprofits, their grantees are going to be too reliant on them. And so we operate from this place of fear and distrust with each other. And all these kind of inherited policies like capping. First of all, overhead isn't a thing. It's not in the Bible. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the tax code. It's not in, I don't know what else. It's out of thin air. We have this thing called overhead. Because a bunch of accountants said, when you fill out your 990 or your auditors, this is what you got to do. Take their money, put it into these buckets. Admin, fundraising, program. Fundraising and admin equals over a thing called overhead. So now we all go around doing, what? It doesn't make sense. So then the government says in the 990, give us your ratio from your audit. So it's but it's made up, it doesn't make any sense, it's not productive. And then funders say we're going to cap that because overhead is a negative thing, it's indirect, it's not program. As if programs could run themselves. We're not self-driving cars. And I don't think we should be. So the question is what's preventing all of us from investing, from getting past this cycle of don't ask, don't tell, if you will. Anybody have thoughts from your role, whether you're a donor? All of us are probably donors in this room at some level or another. So from your donor hat, or your nonprofit board member hat, or your nonprofit worker hat, or executive director hat? Trust. Oh, sorry, I said that. Go ahead.
I would actually say trust-based philanthropy has been tremendous for us. We got a grant from the Start Small Foundation. It was a 45-minute Zoom call, and 3 days later, there was $1 million in the bank account.
Wow.
But we had been referred, and their whole premise is, you're already vetted, we trust what you're doing, go do your job. And we kept trying to give them a quarterly report, and they're like, we don't want your quarterly report. So, but it speaks to, they trust you to do your job.
And most don't. Right. Most aren't behaved that way.
So,
thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
God, move toward that.
Go ahead.
I think two things. One is courage. It's the biggest barrier.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is from my government funders, right?
Yeah, the market rate is a really good thing you brought up, because I've heard some people argue that, you know, our market is already, the market for our jobs, right? If you're looking at comparable pay for comparable, you know, comparing ourselves to other underpaying organizations, like, yeah, so our market rate, when we think of that as the way to set salaries, we're continuing to keep everything sort of artificially low. There's an academic in Washington State who compared the same jobs in for-profit, government, and nonprofit, and found that like nonprofit people doing the same thing as people in other sectors are making like 30% less. So why are we looking at a market rate of nonprofit salaries instead of that job across the full market of that job? So go ahead, I'm sorry, I think you were going to say something.
Coming off of trust and courage, you know, are we having a full conversation with our donors? Are we educating them in what it truly costs to run our business? Because that's what it is at the end of the day, it's a business. And so do we have enough courage to start that conversation?
Sorry.
Do we have enough courage in having those conversations at the risk of, we might lose a donor, but we also may gain a sustainable donor that's going to stick with us for now 20 years over the one-time donation they thought they were going to do. Because we were willing to have that conversation of, you know, asking them what their goals and objectives are, and then expanding that conversation into, hey, here's what it really takes to run that program that you want to fund. This is the manpower it takes. This is the hours that go into it. But we have to be courageous in those choices and build the trust with our donors.
Yeah, and being vulnerable and being courageous actually builds trust more than withholding information because of fear. Fear doesn't build trust. So, okay, I think, so what we've kind of moving toward solutions here, we've put together a framework that we call Funding That Works, which is sort of from the idea of we need funding that works for the people who do the work. And so the central idea of the framework is the practice of talent investing, which is the intentional deployment of capital to support and develop nonprofit leaders and workers. Some of the elements of that are that it's baked into grant making and fundraising. It's capital, could be financial, could also be social, like we're talking about trust and courage. It could be political capital that's needed to get government to shift its policies and practices. Supporting people, supporting, not just developing, but supporting. In our definition, we say support and develop because so much of our emphasis is always on leadership development, professional development. And there's sort of this subtle underlying thing of there's something missing that needs to be developed. So we added the word support to say, like, we need the support. We don't always need to be developed. Workers, not just leaders. There's so much emphasis on leaders, leadership, executive directors, but we're an entire workforce. So we need our cooks and our social workers and our janitors and everybody to be decently supported and developed, not just the top people. And then justice and opportunity for all. So if we want, we can really lead in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our whole society. I mean, we're a more diverse workforce in the nonprofit sector than many other areas, but so we can really lead on that and create organizations that do feel welcoming and supportive and to everybody, regardless of or inclusive of people across age, race, class, gender, geography. And so that's a little bit about the idea of talent investing. Those are some of the key elements. We also, as I mentioned, we did this research study we call talent justice. And so talent justice is one of the kind of principles and practices within talent investing. So what we found in our study was that this deficit of investment in the nonprofit workforce has a compounding impact on people of color, women, and other groups. So everybody may suffer, but some people are getting the short end of the stick from some of these practices. And we've asserted that talent investing really has to use an intersectional lens when we approach some of the nuts and bolts like wages and benefits. We also have to think about equity and inclusion at the same time. So you can find that study, an executive summary, the full thing, and I can send it out to you all via Kathy as well, but you can find it on our website. So I wanted to share a couple things. So the idea of that it's baked in that I mentioned, that it's integrated into your fundraising and grant making. So for me, I get really frustrated that often investments in our workforce are kind of a garnish, right? It's like a nice to have. It's like a nice thing to have, but it's like the last added first cut. And so very few people really eat the garnish on their chicken dinner, because it's not needed. It's not essential to the meal. But talent investing in our staff, like I was saying with Flip the Formula, it really ought to be a primary ingredient in our fundraising, in our nonprofit management and governance, and in grant making and giving as well. And so often these investments I've seen are things like what I got, those fellowships, right? They were very beneficial to me, but they didn't benefit anybody else, right? And so we often, when we think of investing in people, it's often about investing in one person. And so that's a lot of foundations will fund fellowships, and those are very valuable, but they don't help, like let's say the Durfee Foundation in LA, they fund sabbaticals. There's a bunch of funders who fund sabbaticals for nonprofit executive directors. It's awesome for the executive director, they need the sabbatical, right? But it often doesn't help the organization establish the money and policies to give everyone a sabbatical, to earn the right to a sabbatical. So this slide's about how do we shift from just thinking about funding the sabbatical for Kathy to making sure that Tri-Valley Nonprofit Alliance has the money to, and other systems to support sabbaticals for everybody on the team. So we call that people systems, policies, practices, and other things that are needed to invest in our employees. So what we've put out there during this California set of events is that we need a new type of grant. We've had general operating support, and we've had restricted project or program support for a long time as the two main kinds of grants you can get. Obviously there are others. There's capacity building, there's capital to build a building, capital campaign kind of money. But these are the two kind of main kind of grants out there, right? And they're kind of a binary between, it's either restricted with caps on funding for salaries, and it's about the line items, and it's about the program or the project happening. It's not an investment in the organization. Or it's general operating support, right? Like, we're gonna give you this $1 million, we don't want your reports, we're not gonna, like the opposite, right? It's all about giving the organization the flexibility it needs, not being restricted to a project or program. But what happens is that with this, it's very clear why this doesn't end up investing in the staff, right? With this, everyone thinks, okay, well, this is what we need to do in order to invest in the staff. But what happens is it ends up covering costs of late payments from government. It ends up seeping into the budget where all the holes and cracks are, and doesn't actually incentivize you to pay your people better or hire new people or really invest in your staff. There's no incentive structure around it. And when an ED goes to their board and says, we just got this gen op money, they're probably not going to say, and I want to spend it on my own salary or whatever. They're going to say, like, how can we use this to like grow our programs or start that program we've been dreaming about doing. And it's going to be hard for the board to get the board to say, you know what, let's take this gen out money and invest it in our staff. Because they think, well, we got to do some of this kind of stuff with that money. You got to keep overhead low. So neither of these kind of grants create the incentives we need. So we're proposing the SOS grant to save our sector, save our staff. We call it the Staff Operating Support Grant. So this kind of grant would combine the other two types. It would be restricted for investments in the staff. So remember here's the nonprofit budget. This is up to my thumb is staff, here's program, and over here is, up to here is program, and here's staff. This would be restricted for staff investments. Might not be your full staff budget, but let's say it's a good chunk. Okay, so it's restricted for investments in the team. Within that, it's unrestricted. So if you need to use it for the sabbatical, use it for the sabbatical. If you want to use it for bonuses for everybody, use it for bonuses. If somebody new gets hired and they need a coach, use it for the coach. So it's not restricted by line item or whatever. It's restricted for the staff and it's flexible within that. So the idea is it draws on the best of both. And it creates the incentives and the opportunity for investing in the staff. And you can still be held accountable as a nonprofit by your funder for what did you do with the money to invest in your staff? And why did you do that? And, oh, it changed over time? Okay, bye. Let's talk about that, tell me. And so we think that things like staff operating support grants or other kinds of talent investing can give us a new cycle in which funders actually are offering the money and the signals and the incentives, a healthy supply of money for staff investments. And so the nonprofits have the ability to ask for what they need. They have the signals, they have the incentives to create a healthy demand, not an artificially tamped down one. And so funders would actually hear from grantees and nonprofits what they actually need for their staff and what they're doing, how they're using the money, and how it's valuable. And instead of it being driven by, all those racism, sexism, fear, and inherited old kind of policies that nobody knows why they got created, this could be driven by talent justice, by hope and trust and courage. I love that you added that word. And new policies and practices that actually make sense for a professional field that's, millions we have somewhere between 12 and 13 million Americans earning a living through nonprofit work. We're not a charity, a volunteer-based sector anymore. And we're delivering all that value that we talked about at the beginning. So we need to be appropriately compensated and treated through a talent investing cycle. So these are some questions you could think about. What changes should be prioritized to address the current challenges facing our workforce? What specific actions could you take in your role or your institution to tackle these challenges? And how can we across our silos of funders, nonprofits, and intermediary institutions collaborate more effectively to overcome these challenges? So those are some of the questions we've been having people talk about at our regional events and that we're going to be talking about at our statewide event coming up later this year. These are some of the partners who've been involved with the regional events.
So do you have a success story anywhere?
Well, the first two events just happened 2 weeks ago.
What do you do with your SOS grants?
I literally just introduced the SOS concept at the Northern California event 2 weeks ago. Huh? Hot off the press. So this is the third time I've talked about it.
How did funders
people were like, okay. Like what, I mean, I haven't heard from people specifically about that yet, except one funder at the end of the LA event said, we're talking about creating like a pledge thing that funders and nonprofits can sign on to say we're gonna invest in workforce. And one funder said, we would sign a pledge like that at our foundation. Just don't make it SOS grants. Like she was like, we wouldn't sign on to that, but we would sign on to a more general pledge to invest in the workforce of our grantees. So I need to follow up with her to see what was it that was sticking for her on that. That's the only specific feedback I've gotten about that so far. So I'd be curious what you guys all think. Does anyone want to give me feedback about the SOS?
I'd like maybe some clarification, because I think about it, I'm retired from the Lord nonprofit. Oh, hello. On? Yes. So when I think about staff operating support, I worked at a large nonprofit, and I'm going back to what you said about support. What does support mean, as opposed to giving someone a raise, because then you are making a longer-term commitment, which is always the great fear that, well, we got the grant for 3 years, what's going to happen after that?
Mm-hmm.
So could you speak a little more, you use the idea of sabbaticals, but we're really in a pressure cooker here. We're competing against the for-profits for staff constantly. We can't just look at our own ecosystem about what staff expectations are, because they're looking at, what do I get if I go over to the for-profit sector? So I'm just wondering what pieces might be drawn from that I just don't know about, because I'm not in the workforce anymore. So just elaborate a little more about what you mean about support versus putting it in salary.
Well, I wouldn't call it a versus. I would include salary as, I use the term staff operating support to just kind of mimic the general operating support frame or language. And so, but I did talk earlier about like development versus support. So I think of it's a complex set of things that need to be invested in. It's not just one silver bullet, right? So salaries and benefits are a huge part of it. They're not the only thing. If people were paid a thriving wage, they still might be burning out from the nature of the work, or the lack of other people, working too few people. So I don't, and if you pay some people more, you might not have the money to hire more people. So I'm not saying I'm not offering an easy solution as much as I'd like to. So we actually have a talent investing menu that has 10 different buckets of things that people would think about investing in, which I'm happy to share. It's not in this slide deck. But I definitely would see salary and benefits within staff operating support as an essential thing.
Yeah, I would, thank you. I just want to.
You were trying to clarify if that.
I think this is great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, you.
Do you cover leadership transition at all? Is that an area?
Definitely.
Mainly because that's something that our organization is going through. It's a small example, but went to a foundation specifically around that issue. And they granted us money asking for us, and I assume internally, to match that money. But it was successful because I think it was specific in terms of what you're looking for, in terms of the support, rather than, the wide open field. I don't know what other people's experience, but we just had that.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? It's a challenge you're
Because
specific.
they can understand that from their perspective in working in an organization when they've had transition leadership. They needed probably some support to get through that successfully, to carry on the mission, or whatever the issue might be. But I don't know whether being more specific around what specific area you were needing support in rather than the open-ended.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think, part of what I often advise nonprofits who want to start doing this is really to start a listening process to understand what your staff needs. And that could be anonymous surveys, it could be having a consultant or volunteer interview people so that everybody at all levels can speak honestly about what it's like to work here and what they need to stay here and all of those things that they might not say to their executive director directly. So I think getting to really understand what the whole team needs and then prioritizing. And actually the Ford Foundation has created this whole initiative called Build Initiative to do capacity building with a set of their grantees. And where they start is just that. They have a survey. Everybody in the grantee organization gets to fill out the survey. And it's about like all different areas of capacity. It's all these different areas. And then they get together with a facilitator, a consultant, as a staff, and they prioritize, they compare how they rated things. And it's a very simple matrix, and it's actually open source. You can find it online there, the survey. And so then the team prioritizes, like our top priority is this. And so that's what then they use their Ford Build grant to address. So I think you're right, getting specific is very helpful, but specific in a way that's customized to the individual, the stage and needs of one organization, not generic, specific. Everybody gets a sabbatical across all our grantees. Like, not everybody needs a sabbatical right now, so let's customize it. I think that's been my main message. Yes?
Yeah, I'm curious what feedback you've gotten from funders. You just mentioned capacity grants. And I'm just wondering, since staff operating support sounds to me like a kind of capacity grant, is this, I don't know, it's not exactly pushback, it's just sort of helping funders who like to put things in boxes from my experience. Does it help if you use that language, this is a kind of capacity grant that we're seeking? I know it's a new concept and perhaps a new term.
No, it's a really good question and totally valid. So thank you for asking it. I think there's two things I don't like about capacity building grants. One is they're generally small add-ons to your main grant. And two, they generally ignore the staff and worry about technology, chairs, strategic plans, other things. And they don't really address the people systems and the people.
Consultants, which is my role.
So I think what I'm trying to say is bake it into the main grant. Don't have it be the main grant is for program, and then there's a little supplemental grant for like capacity or for burnout, well-being. You know, there's this whole raft now of mini grants for well-being because all the funders are talking about all the nonprofit burnout. And I'm like, well, it's not a mini problem, so why is it getting mini solutions? It's a big problem, it's the main problem. So that's why I'm saying bake it into the grants themselves. Structure your grants as staff operating grants.
So there's education you have to do to clarify this is not one of those.
Yeah, I mean, capacity building can be, this could be, you know, a capacity building grant. I don't really care if that's the language that a funder wants to use, fine. But the point is, it's not a supplemental. It's not a mini. It's the main game. It's the main ingredient, not the garnish. So if they're not willing to do that, then that's the sticking point, and that's probably going to be the sticking point for a while. A lot of nonprofits are not going to be happy either because they want the general support. Okay, so I wanted to tell you guys that these are our sponsors for the Talent Justice Initiative across the state. So just shout out to the sponsors. And then we are doing this summit, which I know Kathy is planning to come to, and your board chair here and others, hopefully. You can use this QR code if you want to save the date on your calendar directly. And we will have registration and stuff opening within days. So excited, pardon me, I'm excited for that. And that's going to be 3 days of nonprofits, funders, and intermediaries in dialogue with each other about these very issues, plus speakers coming to talk about current pilot efforts to address all these challenges in the nonprofit workforce here in California. So this is just some info that's available from me, my email address. If you want to schedule a conversation with me through my Calendly link, it's there. I know these bit.ly links are a little hard to take in, but we do have lots of free stuff on our website. We have a toolkit. You just have to give us, it adds you to our mailing list if you want to get the content. It's free, and we'd love to have you on our mailing list. And then we have a podcast. Wherever you listen to podcasts, it's called Fund the People, a podcast with Rusty Stahl. And we have over 80 episodes that have come out on all these topics, and more coming up this fall. And our main social media is on LinkedIn, so you can follow our page on LinkedIn as well. I know I'm way over time, so.
We're just coming up on it right now.
Okay.
Good timing.
So thank you all for your attention and engagement. I really learned a lot and appreciate it.